Hi, I'm Dave Sherwood, the CEO of Bibliute. I'm here to introduce you to Campus Convos, the podcast where we discuss all things tech and education. Hope you enjoy it. Please subscribe on wherever you listen to your podcasts, and please give a share to others interested in the space. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Campus Convos. Joining me this week to talk about the impact of the new Department of Education on higher ed is Phil Hill, the lead speaker, blogger, analyst, and founder, of course, at Phil Hill and Associates. Phil's blog is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure many of you out there are subscribed. If not, definitely would recommend the Plus Premium tier. The info and everything that Phil sends around is super handy to everyone in our sector, whether you're in tech, investment, or working at an institution as well. So yeah, I've been following Phil for probably 5 or 6 years now, really since we started looking at into the US. And Phil and I have had a few conversations, particularly around our space in the learning content area. But yeah, it's great to have you today, Phil. So first question today, what do you think are the most exciting technological and socioeconomic trends impacting higher education right now?
Well, I guess as long as you interpret exciting as being value neutral, I mean, big changes, we got to pay attention as opposed to, yay, I'm glad it's happening. I mean, the two factors hitting higher education the most are generative AI, even though a lot of the details, we don't know how it's going to land, like which use cases, but I think it's something on the order of as big as the internet in terms of fundamental changes we have to track. So on the technical side, that's the biggest thing that we're tracking right now. And on the other side, I guess it is sort of a fight. On one hand, I would say, particularly in the US, but I believe this is happening in the UK and a lot of other areas, the government policy, particularly that's impacting enrollment and impacting the whole view towards return on investment measurement. Those, I think, are just going to have a fundamental transformation. And I don't think they're really well understood, the implications of what's happening yet. So if I had to pick two, I would say those are the two biggest changes. And I don't think either one of these are quick changes that are going to go away. You know, it's not like the MOOC craze, massive open online courses in 2011, 2012, where sure, we still have MOOCs, but they didn't fundamentally transform education. I think both of these issues that we're talking about are much bigger than that.
Totally. AI is a funny one. You know, some mornings I wake up thinking it's just going to disrupt the whole sector very quickly. And other mornings I wake up thinking, higher education, takes time for change, etc. Yeah. The truth's probably somewhere in the middle. I totally agree with you. It's a fundamental technology change. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. In terms of the return on investment side, it's fascinating. I think a lot of people, of course, in the general public, I saw your newsletter today quoted a number of polls and the difference between sort of the perception of the value of higher education the public has versus the graduates themselves. But clearly the public, and I think I generally agree with the sentiment that there's been too fast an increase in debt relative to earnings, though that's not necessarily true in the UK the last couple of years, but broadly over the last 10 to 20 years. And clearly, the previous UK government and the current Trump administration are trying hard to push forward these return on investment, focuses. But like you've written about extensively, they're very blunt instruments, and it's very hard to tell exactly which schools and which programs are going to be impacted and whether it will have a positive or negative effect overall. But it'd be great to get your perspective in a bit more detail around how the Trump administration's initiatives look like they're going to impact schools. Which ones do you think it will actually help this like ROI metric anyway, or will sort of just push things backwards?
Sure. And actually, to start out with and to put some context, when we say the Trump administration, the bill that has really changed things, the one big beautiful bill that's now statutory, it's in law. This was a concept and an earnings premium that was actually written by Democrats. So we have huge media, yes, we have a lot of polarization over here, but in terms of the idea that higher education programs need to provide a value for people and a need to impact their earnings, that is very bipartisan. It's just people don't like to
Yep.
acknowledge that. And the specific earnings premium metric came almost directly from the gainful employment regulations that were pushed through by the Biden administration. So we're talking something that is bipartisan and gaining momentum. It's only going to increase from here. And so I think that what's important to do is to separate the concept, which seems to have such big agreement on, that we do need to look at program. It has to be program level, not just institution level, and that there needs to be some accountability for institutions offering these programs that students are making a gain. And a lot of the gain needs to be economic. We need to separate that concept with the actual policy and the actual metrics in place. And that's where you're saying the blunt instrument issue comes in. And so, for example, what's happening here, what's gone into law, and they're trying to figure out the regulations based on it now, is it simply says, if you're an undergraduate, are you coming out of the program with higher earnings than somebody who came out of high school and didn't go to college? So it's just that concept of, are you making more coming out of it? For a graduate program, it's a lot more complex, but essentially it's saying, if you go to a master's program, are you coming out of that with higher earnings than if you just stuck with a bachelor's degree? That's the basic idea. But then the only thing they do is this comparison group is measured at the state level. So Alabama is going to have a different metric that you compare against than Michigan, than whatever. But as I've written about, that's where the blunt instrument comes in. It's more the comparison metric, and it doesn't take into account, take Texas. People who live in Austin, Texas, are going to be making a lot more money than people in a very rural border area like McAllen, Texas. And by averaging them or aggregating them together with one metric for Texas, now you have this disadvantage for people in McAllen. And sorry for picking on that one town, but it really exemplifies the point. And so you get into the issue of, because it's such a blunt instrument, you're actually going to be discouraging academic programs that are intended to really help lower income areas and people getting degrees. It might be allied health, whatever the case, in making it. So obviously I don't have time to go through all the details here, but the real blunt instrument is that. The other part of it being very blunt is the fact that it's just looking at earnings, and it doesn't take into account the actual tuition or what the program cost, nor does it take into account what's the actual debt that students are, coming out of the program with, which is the thing that we care about. So it's blunt,
but
it's
calculate
also
ROI without the I, really.
Yeah. And so, exactly. So theoretically, I'm making this up, but what if you have a program in Austin that costs $50,000 a year and a program in McAllen, Texas that costs $5,000 per year? Well, you shouldn't be measuring them the same way. So it's very indirect, and it's a very blunt instrument. And so the conceptual level is going to have a big change. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences because of poorly defined metrics. And so I guess my greatest hope is this is pass 1 or 2, really, and that we're going to iterate on this and make it better over time. I certainly hope so. If not, I think this poorly designed metrics is going to overwhelm the conceptual idea that we're actually trying to get to, that most people tend to agree with at the conceptual level, but they don't understand the impact.
Given the broad public support in polling and, like you say, bipartisan sort of approach, hopefully that means over time there's iterations and improvement rather than implementation and retraction and that sort of polarized policy making we've seen it too much of. So geographical points, even within a given state, are clearly something missing from the metric. So is the I, like the investment, the yes. cost. What other points, like demographics as well? I'd assume a student going to like the University of Texas is probably on the path to like generate a pretty good income, whether or not they went to the University of Texas, based on demographic factors, rather than, a student going to community college, a rural community college. Like, that doesn't seem like a fair comparison for an ROI either. But like, are there other factors we haven't discussed that you think could be incorporated in? And do you think there's a metric that could be created that would be less blunt and more useful?
Well, first of all, on the geographic or the location within a state, and I've already done some analysis and say this could affect the comparison earnings by plus or minus 25%. So it's a significant number. We're not talking a 3 or a 5% difference. In California, I think it was minus 25% if you're the disadvantage if you're in the wrong area. So it's very significant. To answer your question, are there ways to do it? Part of my analysis was to prove that the data from the exact same source already exist. So the comparison is coming from the American ACS, the ACS survey from the Census Bureau, and it's got a flag that goes much lower level than a state level. So I simply plugged in and used this geographic flag, in which there's a lot, like there's more than 200 in the state of California. So that might be fine-tuned, but I did it to prove that you could, from the same data source, use a much better metric. And I certainly hope as they get into the rulemaking, they find a way to pull that in. But as far as your biggest question, I think gender is the other really big one. And I've done stuff that even at the state level, there's what I call the female disadvantage. Same concept. The comparison earnings is going to be much higher the earnings of a high school graduate for males is much higher for females. So if you have a program that's predominantly female, you're really comparing against the average between females and males because it's not specific to the type of program. And that creates what I call a female disadvantage. That's quite significant as well. So gender is another one. And there are various reasons. I did not do the demographic study saying here's why. Is it discrimination? Is it the fact that you're factoring in part-time work as you're raising a family? Whatever the reasons are, gender clearly has an impact on earnings, and the blunt instrument doesn't take that into account, and it's going to cause an issue. There's a lot of people arguing that race should be measured. And I think that if you look at the data, there is an impact on earnings. But I think we also need to be realistic. Race is something that the Trump administration is not going to try to offset for because of race in the same way that they might do that from a gender perspective. So I realize there's a little bit of gamesmanship involved. But I think the two that are most likely to have some sort of acknowledgement from the Trump administration are geographic areas within the state and gender. So those are the two biggest ones that I would focus on as they go forward. There's one other that's non-demographic. Not 100% of the value of a degree is whether you make more money coming out. A lot of times there's just the critical thinking that I'm going to figure out my career path longer term, or I'm in public service and I'm choosing to take a low income job, a public service defender if you've got a legal degree. So not everything should be measured by specific earnings. But that's the direction we're going, and we need to deal with it.
And you think that's a particularly interesting point. I think we look at programs like nursing, for instance, a variety, as you say, a variety of roles where you work directly for the government. One's super interesting. So I was at the North Carolina president's meeting just about a month ago, and they were all saying, it was AFIT. I've been to both in the same week, but it was AFIT actually. And the presidents there are all saying they've cut their early childhood programs, in part because it doesn't pay. But like, how are we training people for early childhood? I have a 2-year-old, and it feels like a critical labor shortage in the economy. And these sort of blunt instruments can make these labor shortages much worse and have all sorts of problems with inflation and other things, right? So how do you think we can solve for the non-demographic points of like positive externalities for certain programs and jobs that aren't covered by income?
Yeah. Well, and by the way, nursing is, that field is one of the safest fields out there. If you look at the actual data of the programs or what their earnings are, it's so in demand, and there are various factors. Nursing programs are actually very safe. Early
Oh,
childhood,
okay.
the biggest the biggest ones from a degree perspective is at the bachelor level. There's a lot of fine arts degrees that are out there. Too many people going into visual arts or fine arts, but there really aren't high paying degrees, or they're looking for the big payoff and it doesn't happen by and large. Um, but so there are different fields that are going to take a huge hit. And you mentioned one, early childhood development. So how are we going to deal with this? If I had to put, I don't know if this is part of the thought process. The people writing the policy, which has been both Democrats and Republicans, I think there's so much of a mindset of we're trying to catch the bad actors, the schools that are deliberately not, offering value, and aha, we caught them. And that's their top priority. I don't know that they've done enough thinking to answer the question you're saying. Well, what about this field? It's critical. It's not going to do well. It's going to impact it. What is going to happen? There is an argument to say, well, some of this will create market pressure to, find ways to add value to what the students make. Or maybe there's an argument saying, well, you don't need to take out loans to go into a program. Make it cheap enough that you don't have to have student loans. So there might be, I guess there's the concept that's not well defined, that's purely, let's see how market pressure on academic programs will impact it. We'll figure it out. That's not a good answer. I'm just trying to think of how to answer your question. I think there's going to be a lot of fields where we're going to be scrambling for the next, I think, 4 or 5 years to figure out what the unintended consequences are. A lot of that's going to be discipline based, like you said, the field of early childhood development. I think we're going to have a lot of pain over the next 5 years figuring out what these impacts are and then trying to see what can be done about it. At the same time, we're going through this rulemaking process where the Department of Ed needs to take the law and to figure out what are the new rules. And during that process, I've done analysis of the public comments coming in, and a lot of them align with what you're saying. And they can't ignore the law, but maybe they create exemptions. In these fields, we're going to either exempt early childhood development, or we're going to somehow tip the scales in their favor, or allow an appeals process to get around the issue. So the actual regulations, there is some chance they're going to be able to minimize this unintended consequence in the long term. But we won't know that until, I'd say, December or January, if the current rulemaking will deal with this or not. If not, like I said, my prediction is it's going to be about 3, 4, 5 years of, oh my gosh, we're going to be discovering what the impacts are and scrambling to figure out, well, what do we do with it? And then that deals with, I mean, you've got a 2-year-old. Well, what do you do in the meantime? What's happening to the pipeline? And so I think there's going to be a lot of benefits, but there's going to be a lot of pain. And in that type of time frame, I think we won't know the answers for a couple of years.
And you raised the point before that if the blunt instrument creates too much pain, people might start to lose support for the core concept of improving ROI, which could set things back even further. So that's always the risk with policies that are too strong or too bold, as well. Do you think we'll see like the core ROI improve with the blunt instrument as it's set? Do you think we'll see over the next 2 or 3 years the ratio of debt to earnings improve. And I guess it's hard to, like, some of that is the economy, right? So I'm sort of
Yeah,
asking that
exactly.
question without, like, like macroeconomic factors kind of staying the same, like a ceteris paribus condition. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, this type of return on investment is not the only part of the policy change. At the same time, there's pretty significant limits on the amount of student debt you can take out. Lifetime, like a graduate non-professional program, I think it's up to $50,000 per year, up to $100,000 lifetime for that type of program. A professional program is going to be double that. Undergraduate program is going to be less than that. So at the same time, the loan limits are going down. If you factor those two things together, what I'm already seeing is what you described in North Carolina. I think there's going to be a much stronger focus for statewide systems, for individual colleges and universities saying, hey, this program offered within this division over here, it's not just up to the dean to figure out what to do. The institution has got to do a lot more program review saying which programs are we offering and what do we need to change. The University of Chicago, part of what they're doing, although it's with their case, it's driven more by institutional debt, the amount they borrowed, but it's also the upcoming programs. They're also looking at saying, okay, we're still going to offer these humanities-based graduate programs, but we're going to limit enrollment. We're going to take fewer students in there, something that's more balanced to what the actual job environment is aligned to. Because if you take in too many students, a lot of them aren't going to get jobs in their field. So if this is sort of my positive hat, I think the changes are already starting to force schools to look at the program level and to figure out how do we balance programs, either by we can't offer these anymore, or we need to lower the price on this, or find other state grants, ways to support students that are not loan based. And I think that is where the possibility is for what you asked to get into actually improving earnings and debt overall. So it gets back to that concept. I support the concept. I do think we're going to see benefits from it, but in my opinion, we don't need all the pain that we're about to go through. We could have done this better. So
It doesn't feel that hard based on, like, what you've said, to turn the blunt instrument into a more specific, useful one, right?
yeah.
So hopefully the department, hopefully they're listening, or at least they just think of this independently. But that
Well,
seems like
keep in mind their hands are tied. The Congress passed a law and they put a lot of this into law. So there's only so much the Department of Education can do. This is very different. Gainful employment, the actual law says these programs need to provide gainful employment. That's all that was in there. And then the department just went wild with 100+ page regulations with their interpretation. This is different. This is a lot of detail in one big, beautiful bill that is law. So their hands are tied. So I guess part of what you're going to see here, assuming they see the problems that you and I are talking about, and I think they do, but there might be an element of, hey, that's part of the pain we have to go through. But assuming they want to address them, they're going to have to be pretty creative. Their hands are tied a lot in this process, and that's very different than what we went through even a year ago. So just keep that in mind.
When's the next reconciliation bill? Is it 1 year?
The reconciliation bill, the concept there is it's this mechanism to
the budget.
I mean, yeah, if you go watch Schoolhouse Rock, then we come up with bills. And in the appropriations level, I think it's 6 or 7. You're supposed to have 6 or 7 core bills that set how Congress spends money. Then they pass those and they move on. What's happened? Nobody does that anymore. We gave that up like 15 to 20 years ago. And now they come up with these monster reconciliation bills that include everything once a year. And they can get around the 60 vote in the Senate.
The filibuster.
The filibuster rule so that they can push it through and make it happen. So the most often it happens is once a year. So to answer your question is the soonest there will be a
Next year.
reconciliation bill will be next January.
Do you think the next reconciliation bill or one after that, there's a possibility that there's a tweak to the wording to fix the blind instrument, or you think that's just not realistic?
Well, keep in mind, to get this through and to set so much of this policy, it required the reconciliation process. And so everything was in that one big, beautiful bill, and that had to go that way. To fix problems, you're going to have to get a lot of this fixed by Congress, passing bills again. But I think there is a possibility of a standalone bill that's not tied to reconciliation.
Bipartisan, potentially, right?
Yes. So that's a possibility. And there's some talk in Washington of, hey, we know we've got to fix some of this stuff. That is possible. What would be the soonest it would happen? I don't think it'll happen until, same time frame. Maybe in the January, there could be a standalone bill. I do not think that it would get fixed with a reconciliation bill, even if the Republicans push for a reconciliation bill. It's just too big. That's part of the problem. It created a blunt instrument. You're not going to be able to solve it that way. So I'm hoping for a standalone bill that can have more nuance, ideally bipartisan, to go fix and improve things. Could it happen? Yes. I wouldn't expect it to happen until some of this reality starts hitting in 2026.
But until I do people feel the pain and it's fed back to the politicians. Yeah, that seems logical. When was the last higher education bill passed? Wasn't it under Obama, like a very long time ago?
Oh, that's getting to the whole Higher Education Act. And so the original thing was in 1968, and it gets reauthorized, the Higher Education Act. And the last time it wasn't even in the Obama, it was prior to that. I think it was during the Clinton administration.
Or maybe my question's incorrect. The last standalone bill that referenced higher education was under Obama, I think.
I don't know. Right? I don't know the details. You might be right. I mean,
and I think it covered gainful and it covered inclusive access and a bunch of things we're living with today.
Well, a lot of that came from the 1992 law. So even before the Obama, what I'm aware of with the Obama administration is not so much congressional law. It is significant government policy reacting to it. And a lot of that reaction is back to the 1992 reauthorization, particularly around incentive compensation. So there has been more since 92 at the congressional level dealing with education. But that's the big one, I think, that's impacted it. Obama administration created a lot of regulations.
Yes, so the DoE, the Chevron ruling that the Supreme Court's recently undertaken means that you can't really regulate like that anymore. But it's unclear to me, has that Chevron ruling had much of an impact on departments and their regulations?
It's not yet. Some people argue that the Chevron deference, which basically means it's going to be a much stricter, judges can get involved in court cases and say, hey, your regulations went far beyond what the lawmakers intend. Yeah.
You potentially see more legislation like the BBB that's very specific in how it's designed because they know there's not going to be any rules made. So anyway, sorry, finish your train of thought.
I don't know if that's, that's a great point. I don't know if Chevron deference, or the ending of the deference, if that actually contributed to us having too many details in this bill. It might be. And if so, the answer to your question is, we're seeing an impact right now. Moving forward at the regulations, like how you interpret it, it's already causing people who are writing rules that they need, the regulations, they need to think about this. Would this survive a court case? But I think this is going to be bigger than what we're already seeing. In other words, I think the Chevron ruling will have a huge impact. It will put more pressure on you better write some of this into law if you expect this policy to go into effect. I think it's going to have a huge impact. I've had other people who think I'm too optimistic that that's going to happen, including some lawyers. So I don't think there's general agreement on how big of an impact. But personally, I think this will force a lot more activity back at the congressional level. And so going back to this, the whole topic we're doing right now, this whole Roy Blunt instrument, there's a piece of that saying, be careful of what you wish for. I've been one of the people saying, well, if you really care about this, pass a law. Well, guess what? They did pass a law. And now we're like, oh my goodness, how do we fix this? So it's part of a messy process, but specifically, I do think it'll put more pressure that you better get some of this policy into statute. You can't just turn the Department of Education loose to create whatever rules it wants to.
No, agreed. And on the student side, it sounds like we both broadly agree in the principle of improving ROI, that the blunt instrument probably helps in a lot of cases and then does damage in many other cases.
Yes.
But broadly, the student's probably better off in a 2 to 3 year window. What about if we think about our universities and colleges? What are they going to see over the next year or two from this? They're going to see decreased enrollments. They're going to see decreased revenue. Like, what do you think the picture looks like for them? And maybe talk about separately, community colleges and the universities.
Well, so community colleges, I think there are quite a few programs that won't be eligible for federal financial aid, and it could be up to 15% of programs, but a lot of them are smaller enrollment programs. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of states where there's enough state support, state grants, and stuff like that, where the loss of federal financial aid is not that big of a deal. Borrowing to go to community college is not the thing that's led us to $1.7 trillion in debt. So it's less of an issue there, but it will have an impact. So I think it's going to hurt the revenue on a lot of community colleges, forcing them to, we can't offer this program anymore, or we can't offer it as a degree program. They're going to have to be a lot more selective. There's going to be pressure. Can the state up their support to offset some of these changes? So I think you're going to see that type of institutional financial analysis. The biggest negative is what you mentioned with, early childhood development. There's certain things where you're like, oh, geez, that field is going to suffer for a while. If you look at bachelor degree, more of the 4-year type of school, the regional public universities, a lot of private, where a lot of it's undergraduate. It's going to be institutional finance. I think it's going to cause a lot of them to say, well, a lot of us are tuition dependent, but we're going to lose tuition in certain programs. And it's going to force them to do a lot more of a program by program evaluation. I think it's going to push a lot more of the smaller on the edge type of colleges and universities to close. It's going to be one of the biggest impact there because they're at the margin already. So sure, it might just be 2, 3, 5% of programs, but that might be enough to push them over the edge. The other thing, which I haven't done enough data analysis on, the schools that have over-relied on master's programs as a cash cow to support the finances for the entire institution, that's going to be probably the biggest change moving forward. There are too many master's programs where the total cost is upwards, well above $100,000, some $200,000 plus. And you're just not going to have you definitely are relying on loans in that area for students to be able to afford it. It's not just the ROI, it's that elimination of grad plus and the limitation of loans. That's going to have a huge impact, and it's going to go well beyond grad school because of all the cross-subsidizing. It's not just going to affect, well, this program, we can't offer it or we can't make the same money from it. You're going to say, yeah, but we relied on that money to support the overall institution, and so our total income is going to go down. That's probably going to be the biggest impact, is at the master's level. And in defense of everybody who's been pushing ROI, that's where so much of the student debt situation comes from, or master's programs. And that is going to be impacted by this focus. So I think that's the biggest one, and we don't talk about it enough. But, you can easily argue, well, that's good. We shouldn't be charging $200,000 for master's programs, or, to make students have to make that choice in the first place. Now, how are they going to deal with it? A lot of them, they're going to have to limit enrollment like University of Chicago is starting to do. So I think there are going to be fewer enrollment options at the master's level. I think there's going to have to be a lot more creativity to find lower cost programs that fit within the limits. I don't know that that's going to get to, the Georgia Tech online Masters of Computer Science that dramatically lowered the cost of the program. And now Georgia Tech, I think they enroll upwards of 10% of all Masters of Computer Science students in the country because of that low-cost program. I know there's going to be pressure for schools to be more creative and create these options, but that's different than we will see a wholesale change. So let's just treat it as that's what I'm going to be watching for. I hope that we're going to be more creative in finding lower cost options, but I'm not convinced it's going to happen as broadly as I think it should.
Totally, totally. I mean, there's been so many different things over the last 2 decades that in theory people thought would lower costs a lot. Obviously the MOOCs, then more recently just full online degrees. The whole for-profit segment, popped up, and some of those do offer very low prices. But I mean, broadly, to see change in this sector, you need to see basically all institutions change, because the reality is that there hasn't been many examples of like a Grand Canyon or a Southern New Hampshire or this Georgia Tech example where a program or an institution will pull students away in huge numbers from other institutions. But the previous point you made, if we see more, I guess it's particularly like private universities and colleges, if we see more closures, maybe then we see those students going to these new programs that are more efficient or whatnot.
Yeah.
Purely anecdotally, for me, I was briefly at Oxford before I dropped out and created the company, but the master's programs there fit exactly what you were saying. They were high priced, and often I didn't quite understand what the program was. They had like these fancy names, and it wasn't really clear what the employment. It wasn't clear to me what the jobs even were at the back end of the program. I mean, I wasn't in the program. I'm sure many of them are of value, but it does strike me as an area that there is, if we're talking about a blunt instrument, an instrument like that could be somewhat successful relative to things like early childhood, where it's going to be a net negative, I think, pretty clearly. Another side topic, so the risk sharing idea, so students not completing, then the institution has to share that risk. How do you think that's going to unfold and impact the institutions?
It's not there. I mean, so what happened in the spring? So that was the House of Representatives that was pushing risk sharing, and it was very different than the earnings premium. So the House was pushing something that originally called from CCRA, college cost. I forget what it stands for, but it was complex. It wasn't blunt. It had a series of things saying, okay, we're going to look at all of your students, not just graduates. And if you're getting a lot of students that are have this amount of debt and they're not able to pay it off, well, that's a direct indicator that the value's not there, even if part of the problem is students not finishing the programs and not starting a company. But, and there's going to be a risk sharing where schools have to pay a percentage of that unpaid debt back to the government. Then they had this grant program saying, if you're a school offering lower cost programs, we're going to provide grants to support you in how you do that. And so it was sort of this complex carrot and stick method that got into risk sharing. When it came to the reconciliation negotiations, a lot of people finally saw it was too complex. It's like, how will you ever be able to measure this? But it also got into politics. So, for example, I did an analysis saying, hey, you know who's going to benefit the most from this? Community colleges. They're going to get a couple $2 billion of additional funding because of risk sharing, if you look at the details. But politically, they hated the idea of risk sharing, and they lobbied against this, this approach of risk sharing, even though it would have benefited them. Well, when push came to shove, and I think it was close to May, and it was getting close to the deadline of we've got to sign this, all of a sudden it went to the Senate, and the Senate, to be quite honest, they didn't even negotiate on this. They substituted the earnings premium and the ROI only blunt instrument we talked about and completely stripped out risk sharing. That's what became law, is earnings premium. So they got rid of all of the risk sharing. Now, conceptually, implementation, I don't know how they could have implemented what they were writing within the House with risk sharing. But conceptually, it did not have the same problems we're talking about. It had a lot of nuance. It looked at multiple factors. It encouraged low-cost programs. It's all gone, at least in terms of law. So there's nothing to react to at the federal level. Some states, Texas is one, are trying to push similar concepts in their state funding. And maybe, we're talking about like a standalone higher education bill. Maybe they're going to revive this idea. This is part of how they improve this ROI to earnings premium type of metric by reintroducing something, but in a more realistic way. But the biggest issue is there's nothing to react to right now. It got completely yanked out in the May timeframe. Now, if you're a school, part of the question is, do you start saying, well, it might come back, so I better think about this ahead of time? But in terms of active legislation at the federal level, it's not there right now.
Interesting. I try to keep tabs on what's happening with all of the legislation and rulemaking and whatnot, but sometimes I don't catch things exactly. Well, Phil, really appreciate having you on today. It's been a really fascinating. I've learned a lot from deep diving into this ROI topic and the blunt instrument, as we keep calling it.
Yes.
Really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you?
Well, most people know, and they get the content, a lot of the stuff we're talking about at the On EdTech newsletter. So just search for that, On EdTech. I think it's onedtech.philhillah.com. But if you just search for it, that newsletter is where I write about so much of this stuff. But I also do a lot of like board meetings for companies where they want to say, hey, come in and we want to talk to you for an hour and ask you a lot of blunt, off the record questions. I definitely try to make the conference circuit. So I'd love to, if somebody wants to say hello, I'll definitely be at different events, the Hull and IQ and EDUCAUSE this fall, the Collegius event that's happening in late September, ASU GSV conference in the spring. So conferences, if you want to say hi, I'd love to say hi. But the biggest answer to your question is you can subscribe to the On EdTech newsletter, either the free version or the plus premium version where there's additional content. That's the best way to do it.
Great. Appreciate it. Yeah, I've been a subscriber of your newsletter for a while. And it's my primary source of particularly things in terms of regulation and how it's going to impact the sector. So yeah, appreciate you coming on. Obviously, thank you to all of the listeners. We're looking forward to catching you next episode. Don't forget to subscribe or send us a like or a review, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the invitation and the conversation.
Oh, no problem, Phil. No worries.